hear that? Okay. So I'm going to talk about Ruby 1.9.1 tonight. My name is Brad Feeley, and I work at Digitaria Interactive. We mostly do client agency kind of work. We have a free and open source side of things where I work, and we use Rails for a lot of that. So my background is definitely using Ruby with Rails. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. So what is it? Ruby 1.9.1 is the next kind of stable release of Ruby. This is from the official Ruby website. And they call it a modern, faster with cleaner syntax and multilingualized. And basically, for a long time, I think a couple years now, we've had Ruby 1.8. Most servers are running 1.86 or 1.87, for most people using Ruby. 1.91 is just the next kind of production-ready release. I'm not sure why. I don't really know the story behind 1.9.0, but I guess that, for some reason, is a development release. And so 1.9.1 is really the one we're moving forward. This is the Ruby to use. If you go to like Ruby's website, this is what you'll see. So definitely it's the way things are going. So I'm going to walk through these three things: speed, syntax, and multilingualization, and then I'll talk about the state of Ruby 1.9.1 and Rails and all that. So it's faster. Everyone's heard, the complaints about Ruby and its speed. So I think Ruby 1.9.1 takes a big step towards debunking that, or moving past that as a stumbling block for people kind of looking to move to Ruby. It got a new virtual machine. So currently Ruby 1.8 uses MRI. I don't know a bunch about this sort of stuff. I come from the Rails side of things, so I don't know, why it's a lot faster, but I guess it smokes. And it was always weird the way the Ruby community was. Like, you had JRuby, which was Ruby on top of Java, that was way faster than just like Ruby. And it was a weird thing. Like, in my mind, it was kind of ghetto. So like, I don't know, it was just never cool. Like when you're talking to Java people and they would bring that up. So I guess some benchmarks. This is faster than JRuby. Some, JRuby's a little faster, but benchmarks are what they are. But it's definitely a lot faster than current Ruby. So that's a good thing. We also get kernel or native threads. So again, like threads aren't really my cup of tea. I don't know a lot about them, but I think we had what are called green threads before, and this is just a more native approach. So it's really like built into Ruby. If anyone knows more about this sort of stuff, like really give a talk, because I think a lot of us are more web developers, and if you have information that kind of help us out as far as the lower level, please share it. So multilingualization, also called M17N. Last year and maybe the year before, Ruby kind of like, I don't know, on the mailing list, everyone was talking about encoding types, doc types, and all this stuff. And definitely, it's really important for people outside the United States and dealing with multilingual apps. So the big thing is file encoding. And really, this is kind of the top level of setting encoding types. So how this works is it uses like a magic comment. So at the top of your source file, either line 1 or 2, in case you have the shebang in your first line, you can set the encoding. And you can do this on each file, which is really cool because say you have someone in another country developing a library, and they can use their own encoding, then you can write your code in like ASCII US, and you can just include them, and they'll both use their own encoding, no problems. Solves a lot of issues with that sort of thing. So you can do something like use a little pi symbol for pi. Probably not a great idea, but you can do it, so that's cool. If you don't set an encoding on your source file, it'll take your, I don't know about Windows, but as far as Linux is concerned, or Unix-based, it'll take your language, whatever you have that set to on your system. So like usually English, US, like UTF-8. So you can also set the encoding at string level. So if you have a variable, myString, you can set the encoding. You can change the encoding. If you try and set an encoding and your string has characters that the new encoding doesn't have, it'll fail. But you can set, there's all sorts of crazy stuff you can do. You can set like replacement characters, you can force it. So definitely, like if this is something that you need for your code, look through the API, because there's a ton of stuff for encoding, and I just kind of took the high level stuff. So, and also you can do encoding when you read files at the I/O level. So say you open a file, you can specify to read it at ASCII, and that's separate from your source file encoding. So you can have, so this file could be, or this Ruby source file could be in UTF-8, and you can open this file in ASCII, which is nice. So, so the syntax changes. There weren't a lot of huge changes. I think for me, like coming from a Rails background, like when a new version of Rails comes out, I expect like everything to break and everything to be different, which is kind of a good and a bad thing for Rails. But for Ruby, it's a lot more streamlined, like subtle differences, cleaning stuff up here and there, taking in some cool parts that other people have done. So I'm going to walk through kind of what I thought was cool and what I thought was neat. There's a lot that I'm not going to cover. So if definitely look through the changelog. There's a huge changelog on the official Ruby site, and it'll go through everything, and you can see everything that I'm just kind of glossing over. So string. String is no longer an enumerable. Before, like Ruby 1.8, you can see went from string to enumerable to comparable, and now string is its own thing, which is I'm not really sure what that means as far as the architecture, but you lose out on all those enumerable methods. So in Ruby 1.8, you have like myString .each, which would go through the lines, and that no longer works. You kind of have to use each line. There's a lot of talk on why they didn't make each line each, even though it's its own class. I'm not really sure what the reason was, but just something to look out for if you're migrating from 1.8 to 1.9. That's kind of a common thing that a lot of people see. These are a few other just kind of random methods that string got. If you do a clear on a variable, it'll just set it to blank. You can do a dot lines and get kind of split it on line endings. Talked about the encoding. Starts with and ends with. Those kind of, I think those came from like active support. And Ruby 1.9 actually took a lot of stuff from active support, which is kind of cool. It's kind of cool to see, some things that I didn't even know weren't part of Ruby core. They showed up from active support, and I was looking through the changelog and I'd see that and be like, that's part of Rails already, and it was just part of active support. So it's kind of cool that is used as a little breeding ground for new Ruby methods. So array. Array didn't get a lot of changes. You see the second line there, values.index, that can now take a block. So before index, you could just pass it the one parameter, and now you can pass it a block, so any sort of logic to pull out that index. There's permutations and combinations that'll return arrays and arrays. ToString on both array and hash before in Ruby 1.8, it just smooshed everything together. So if you did a.2s in Ruby 1.8, you just get like 1, 2, 3. And now it's a little prettier. It uses the same syntax or the same output as inspected. So now inspect and 2s will do the same thing. Makes it a lot easier because like that code, you can copy and paste that inside the quotes, and instead of having to add the commas and the brackets yourself. So pop takes an argument now. So instead of just like popping the single last element, now you can pop more than one. Hash gets some cool features actually. So this is one of my favorite changes is the key value syntax. So in Ruby 1.8, this is probably like, everyone's done this if you're doing Rails, like render action new. And they cleaned it up a little bit in Ruby 1.9. So what they did is if you have a symbol as your key, you can put the column afterwards and not do the equal sign greater than. It's a little cleaner in this situation. It might not, like, it might read weird if you had a bunch or something, but definitely, like, if you showed that to someone that didn't know Ruby or didn't know programming, and you said read the top line, they would say render action is greater than or equal to new. And now Ruby 1.9, it just reads, it just kind of flows a lot more. So cleans up your, your hash parameters. And also, when I was learning Ruby, I kind of fell into the same thing that probably a lot of people did, is hashes weren't ordered. So if you had a hash and you added elements to it, you had no idea what you'd get back. So I know when I was learning Rails and stuff, I had like a hash of all the states, right? And then I had like the state abbreviations. And I was like, cool, I have this hash, I'll use it for, like a select dropdown. And then when I brought it up in the browser, it was just all jumbled. So I went in the IRC, and they're like, oh, hashes aren't ordered. So probably a lot of people go through situations like that. And this is kind of one of those things where from Ruby, like, you would expect it to keep the order, just because everything else, like enumerables, do that, like arrays. So just kind of like least surprise sort of thing. And I don't know, I think it'll help out new Ruby programmers. You can see the difference in 1.8. It put the fourth element at the beginning, and Ruby 9 keeps it at the end. So Procs. Proc's got a new syntax for declaring. So before, you do a lambda, and then you like pass it a block, which is really cool. But blocks, they don't really, the arguments like a in that lambda it's not like a method argument, so you had some limitations there. In Ruby 1.9, they gave you this new syntax, which is like a dash and then a greater than sign. Some people have been calling it a stabby, so I kind of like that. But it basically takes method arguments, which is really cool because it allows you to do things with method arguments that you can't do with block arguments. What's that? So like right here, if you tried to do this in Ruby 1.8, where you had X and then Y is optional, that'll error. Ruby 1.9, if you do it like with the new syntax and it's just like a method argument, you're good. So that's cool. I didn't even know really blocks couldn't do that. Recently, I was doing like a name scope, right, where you pass in parameters through a lambda, and I realized that you couldn't have optional arguments. So you'd have to do some sort of trickery where you send it like an array and then check for like element 2, and if not, then set it. So this will definitely, like out of the box, clean up my code by being able to set optional arguments. And then also a limitation to 1.8, or to blocks in general, I guess, where you couldn't pass a block into a block as an argument. So in that, like Ruby 1.8, you couldn't pass a block or a proc to X without some trickery. So now you can, because it's just they're just method arguments. So you get that flexibility that is standard to methods, and I think that kind of makes sense because I don't know, like those are kind of used as anonymous methods. So weird, like that they didn't just call it like lambda and then the arguments, but yeah, that's what you got. Stabby. So they also changed the way you can call procs. So before, if you had a proc set, you just do a call and send it. And now they kind of clean that up just a bit. You can just do, you can omit the call, basically, and just start passing the parameters. So it reads a little nicer. If you know it's a lambda, then that's really, that's going to be the main thing you're doing. So yeah, cleans that up. Block scope. This is something that I was really surprised when I found out this is how Ruby 1.8 worked. So say you have, like, you declare n outside the block, and then you iterate through like an array, and your block variable is n. I just kind of assumed that in Ruby 1.8 that n would still equal hello world afterwards, but it doesn't. So this is really like, I don't know, I'm sure this is cause people like hours of debugging. It just doesn't. It's just not something you would expect, especially if you think of it in the mindset of anonymous functions. So in Ruby 1.9, you're going to get n as what really what you'd expect it to be outside. So yeah. Debugging. This is kind of a cool thing. So you can do this dash white space. And I don't know if you guys have ever had like a situation where, like say you have your Rails view and it's pretty long. It's got a lot of if statements or whatever, and like halfway in between you forget like an end, and so you get like your error is just like the last line of the file. And it's always like, okay, if you ever have an error on the last line, you know you're missing an end if, or you're missing like a curly bracket. So if you do the dash W when you run Ruby, it'll show you like white space warnings. So if you're missing an end or if you're missing a bracket, it'll point you like directly to the line of where it's at. So I don't know. I'm a fan of running Ruby with warnings on in general because it's, I don't know, good to keep an eye on those things. So if you set that, you'll kind of save yourself some debugging time. You also get method, got some new methods, I guess. So a lot of times when you're including gems and libraries, you kind of get like these methods and you don't really know where they're from. Recently, we started using the write AWS gem along with just the standard Amazon S3 gem. And there was an issue where they conflict if you load attachment foo first or last or something. So these are really helpful in situations like that where there's a conflict from monkey patching. You can take a method and do a .owner on it and figure out like exactly which module is defining that. And if you do a .source location, it'll tell you the file that's actually defining that, which is cool. I mean, I've asked that in IRC before, like, is there a way to find out which file a method is defined in? And there's just no way to do that in Ruby 1.8. So those methods really can help you out there. Installation. When Ruby 1.9.1 came out, like, I didn't do anything. I sat on it for, I don't know, like a month, and I never installed it. I just figured it'd be too hard or it would conflict. I have to uninstall 1.8. But there's this gist. If you pull it up, it's basically just those 5 commands. And it'll install Ruby 1.9 right next to your Ruby 1.8 installation, and there'll be no conflicts. That second to the last line, program suffix 1.9, basically what it does is to all the binaries, it adds a 1.9 to the end. So if you want to run like your regular 1.8 IRB, you just run IRB. And if you want Ruby 1.9, you just run IRB 1.9. The same thing with Ruby. You can do Ruby 1.9. If you want to install gems, gem 1.9. So it makes it really easy to just kind of like dip your toe in and figure out, if it's working for your setup and all that. That's obviously not going to work on Windows. Good luck on that. I have no idea. So Ruby on Rails. Good news is that Ruby on Rails 2.3 is 1.9 compliant. So is, I think Merb is now, pretty sure. Sinatra is. Where you start getting in trouble is all your gems and plugins. So that's kind of where Ruby 1.9 is now. The big name, like your top level libraries, they're pretty much good, or they're right there. But once you start including gems and dependencies, that's where really things start to fall apart. And I think that's what's holding back Ruby 9.1 from like widespread use, which is a shame because like the speed improvements alone plus the syntax is really something we as a Ruby community, we need to get on, because it's so fast. I mean, as far as memory and all that, it'll actually save people money by not having to have bigger instances and use more slices, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of work being done on those gems. There's this site called I think isitruby19.com, and it's a listing of gems, and people can put notes like say this is compatible or this isn't compatible. They'll tell you which GitHub fork is. So that's a good resource if you're trying to get up and running on Rails. Pretty much every gem is probably 1.9.1 compatible if you find like the right crazy fork on GitHub. The thing is, like, I don't know, GitHub's kind of cool where like it makes it so easy to fork that like there's forks everywhere, and trying to track that down and really get that, and like someone will do a fork and make it 1.9 compatible and submit a patch to the maintainer, but they won't have any tests for it, and so then the maintainer they have this like production gem that they just can't start putting random patches into. So it's going kind of slow, but I think it's going the right direction. I think one thing that I thought, not being like a computer science major, was that it wasn't for me like helping out and patching. I just wouldn't be able to do it. But it's really not that way. Really, if you like start with like a plugin that you're using that's all Ruby, not C or anything like that, it's not that bad. Like the differences are small enough where you can probably help out. So I encourage you to, if something's not working, if you're trying something and it's not working, like take a look at the GitHub forks and the commits on those. And if there's not something working, like definitely get your hands dirty and get in the code. Even if you don't like patch it, you'll at least get familiar with with what's going on maybe, and it's not that bad. So a lot of little things are breaking. Maybe it's just a couple lines that you can get in there and really help out the community. So also, Rob has got a little project he's working on, trying to get this ball rolling and get everyone on 1.9. So I think he's going to talk about this when I'm done. Yes? Cool. So I'll leave that for him. Resources. I pretty much just used Google. That's what it's there for, right? So I'm not, like I said, I'm not like the crazy Ruby guy. I kind of just went through like the blog post and tried to compile what I thought was relevant. So just do a search for Ruby 1.9, and there's so much good information out there that goes super deep into like how things work and why they work that way. So definitely just give a little Google and you'll get lots of results. Any questions? Is anyone using Ruby 1.9? No. No one like has anything as far as production. Like that situation? Yeah, yeah. Yeah. Right, right. I mean, you can, if it's a, yeah, I mean, if it's a different variable, and then you can set it, but I don't know. Yeah, yeah. Oh. Well, then, I guess on the bright side, like, there's a with index for everything now. So you can do that with hash. I think you pass it like a separate. Yeah. So they kind of. There you go. Search and replace. Anyone else? Yeah. I'm hoping by like end of the year, like 2010, Ruby 1.9. Like that's my goal. Is like everyone. I don't know. It seems like there's a lot of work that's been done already. It's just kind of amassing it and putting the pieces together and really like polishing up what's been done. You know, people have hacked everything to work, but is it working in the best way? I don't know. So putting some pressure on the maintainers, getting some people to really devote some time to work on stuff that's really not maintained anymore, and hopefully by the end of the year. So that's my goal, but that's just my own thing. I don't know. Anyone else? All right, Rob, you want to talk about your thing? Cool.
That concludes this episode of the SD.RB podcast. See you next time.